She stood alone while everyone whispered. The waltz swelled through the candle-lit ballroom, a swirl of silk and diamonds, but Aloan Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, might as well have been a pillar of marble. Her husband's hand rested on the waist of Lady Clarissa Beaumont, his head bent close to her golden hair, his smile a quiet, private thing that Aloan had never once been offered. It was her first public appearance as his duchess, and he had not spoken to her since they arrived. Not a single glance. The whispers crawled up her spine. She heard every syllable, married for the debt, poor creature, and he still loves Clarissa, and she's nothing but a baron's daughter with a ruined name. Aloan's fingers tightened on her champagne glass, her face carefully blank. She had been waiting for love that would never come, and tonight she finally stopped. The marriage had been forged in duty and resentment 6 months earlier. Aloan's father, a disgraced baron, had owed the late Duke of Ashworth an unpayable sum, a debt born of a financial scandal that had blackened the Trevelyan name. The late Duke's will had been mercilessly specific. The debt would be wiped clean only if his heir, Alexander Ashworth, now the Duke, married the Trevelyan daughter. Alexander, cold and dutiful, had obeyed. But from the moment Aloan stepped into Ashworth Hall, he had treated her as an obligation rather than a wife, a stranger in satin. He gave her a title, a cold bedchamber far from his own, and a distance so vast she could feel frost on her skin every time he passed her in the corridor. In those first fragile weeks, Aloan had tried. She wore the colors he once mentioned, liking on another woman's soft blues, and learned his preferences from the housekeeper. She left small bouquets in his study. She waited up at night, a candle burning until the wick drowned in its own wax, hoping he might knock and ask about her day. He never did. Once she had gathered the courage to touch his arm during dinner, a feather-light plea for connection, and he had stiffened as though she had insulted him. After that, the hope inside her began to wither. The ballroom humiliation was the final blow. When the dance ended, Alexander escorted Lady Clarissa back to her circle of admirers, laughing at something she said. He walked straight past Aloan without pausing, as if she were part of the drapery. Aloan set down her champagne, nodded politely to a scowling dowager, and walked out onto the terrace. The night air bit her bare shoulders, but she did not shiver. She felt only a hollow calm. Something inside her had clicked shut. She would no longer be a woman waiting. She would be a duchess in function only, and she would find her own purpose beyond a husband who could not see her. The next morning, Aloan rose at dawn and dressed in a simple woolen gown, far from the finery expected of her rank. She walked to the estate's village before the manor stirred. There, she discovered a world she had been too heartsick to notice before: tenants with weary eyes, a child coughing in a damp cottage, a widow with no firewood. Aloan knelt beside the child, felt her hot forehead, and sent for a physician using her own pin money. The widow, a woman named Mrs. Harrow, wept as the Duchess instructed a servant to bring cordwood. No one at Ashworth Hall had ever done such a thing. Word spread through the village like a gentle flame. Alexander did not notice her absence. He spent his days locked in his study or riding the estate borders with his steward, his thoughts preoccupied with ledgers and the lingering ghost of a love he thought he should have had. Lady Clarissa was the woman he had intended to marry before his father's will trapped him. He respected Clarissa's wit, her polished elegance, and the easy history they shared. He did not think of Aloan as cruel, only as unnecessary, a quiet, gray figure who had been forced upon his life, and who, he assumed, was content enough with jewels and a title. That she might have a heart that bruised like anyone else had never crossed his mind. Days became weeks. Aloan stopped seeking his company entirely. At breakfast, she was already gone to the village. At supper, she excused herself early with polite, distant words. She no longer wore the soft blues he favored. Instead, she chose dove grays and muted greens, colors that made her sea-glass eyes look deeper and more unreachable. She was always calm, always gracious, but her smiles never reached him. They were for the children she helped, the farmer she taught to read, the old gardener whose aching hands she soothed with a salve she had learned to make. In the village, they began to call her the good Duchess. and the name slipped through the manor walls like a melody Alexander could not quite hear. The first sharp splinter in his indifference came on a Sunday morning. He was walking past the east parlor when he heard his younger sister, Lady Charlotte, laughing. "Truly, Alowan, you should have seen the look on Sir William's face when you bandaged his horse. He was utterly smitten." Alexander paused. Sir William Blackwood was a soft-spoken baronet with kind eyes and a reputation for genuine generosity. The idea of him smitten with Alowan caused a strange, unfamiliar twist in Alexander's chest. He stepped closer unseen. Alowan's voice followed, gentle and dismissive. "He is a kind friend, nothing more, and I have no interest in being smitten. My life is quite full now." Her tone held no bitterness, only a quiet certainty that made Alexander feel oddly shut out. He walked away before the conversation ended, but the twist in his chest remained. Days later, Alexander returned early from business in the county and rode through the village square. There, in the golden light of late afternoon, he saw his wife. Alowan stood by the well with Sir William, a basket of herbs on her arm, her head tilted back in laughter. Sir William was handing her a small, wrapped book, his expression openly admiring. The breeze lifted a strand of Alowan's dark hair, and she tucked it behind her ear with unguarded ease. Alexander's hands tightened on the reins. The horse shifted beneath him. He had never seen her laugh like that, not even once. The smile that had never been his was now freely given to another man, and the sight burned behind his ribs like a swallowed coal. He rode away without approaching, but the image clung to him all evening. That night at supper he tried to speak to her. He asked a simple question, "Did you have a pleasant day?" But the words came out stiff, and she only nodded and returned her attention to her plate. The distance he had built was now a wall he could not scale. The emotional undercurrents shifted again when Lady Clarissa made an unannounced visit. She swept into the drawing-room in a cloud of lavender perfume, her gaze sliding over Alowan as if she were a servant. "Alowan, dear, you must forgive my familiarity," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "I was just telling Alexander how difficult it must be to adjust to society when one comes from such humble scandal." Alowan's teacup paused halfway to her lips. The air tightened. Alexander, standing by the fireplace, looked momentarily uncomfortable, but before he could form a response, Alowan set her cup down with soft precision and smiled. "Scandal is indeed a heavy burden, Lady Clarissa. I find helping those who cannot help themselves lightens it. Perhaps you might try it sometime." Her voice was silk wrapped around steel. Charlotte stifled a laugh behind her book. Clarissa's cheeks flushed. Alexander stared at his wife as if seeing a stranger. He realized then that she had changed. The timid woman who once touched his arm with trembling hope was gone. In her place was a woman who did not need him at all. The discovery of the truth came on a rain-lashed night when Alowan fell ill. She had spent 3 days nursing a feverish family in a leaky tenant cottage, ignoring her own fatigue, and returned to the manor drenched and shivering. By midnight, she was burning with a high fever, her breath shallow, her skin paper-white. The household erupted into panic. Charlotte sent for the physician, but it was Alexander who stormed into Alowan's bedchamber, his face carved from ice and fear. "Why did no one tell me she was out in this weather?" he demanded, his voice cracking. He sat by her bed, clutching her hand, a gesture he had denied her for months. The irony was a cruel blade. He watched her lips move in delirium, murmuring fragments. "The locket, the boy in the river, I never told him." Alexander went still. He remembered a silver locket he had once glimpsed among her things, but he had never asked about it. Now, driven by a desperate need to understand, he searched her jewelry box. Inside, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a tiny silver locket engraved with an ash tree, his family crest. His hands began to shake. He opened it. Inside was a pressed wildflower, long dried, and a scrap of child's writing. "For the girl who saved me, I will find you." The memory crashed into him like a wave. He had been 7 years old, playing near a stream on the border of his father's lands when he fell in. The water closed over his head, and then small hands grabbed him, hauling him to the bank. A girl with dark hair and sea-glass eyes had knelt over him, shivering. He had given her the locket from his own pocket, a trinket his mother had given him and promised he would marry her someday. He had never found her, and eventually the memory faded into a half-forgotten dream. But here was the proof. Elowen was that girl. The girl he had searched for as a boy. The girl he had unknowingly vowed to love, and he had treated her as an invisible burden. He returned to her bedside, the locket clutched in his palm, tears slipping down a face that had not wept since childhood. He gathered her limp hand and pressed it to his lips. "You saved my life," he whispered, his voice broken. "And I made yours a desert. I loved you too late." He stayed there all night, refusing food, refusing rest, watching her breathe as though his own life depended on it. When Elowen's fever broke at dawn, she opened her eyes to find Alexander asleep in a chair beside her, his cravat loosened, his face haggard. The locket rested on the bedside table. She understood immediately. For a long while she simply looked at him, tears slipping into her hair. When he woke, their eyes met and the silence was heavy with everything unsaid. "You knew," he said, his voice raw. "All this time you knew who I was." She nodded once, her voice a thin thread. "You did not remember me. And I did not want your obligation. I only ever wanted your heart, but I could not beg for it." He slid from the chair to his knees, something a duke never did, and held both her hands. "I am begging now," he said. "I have been a fool of stone, Elowen. I was blind, I was cold, I let pride and resentment poison every chance, but I see you now. I see the woman who saves everyone and asks for nothing. I see my wife." His voice splintered. "Please, give me the chance to earn a place in the life you have built without me." Healing was not instant. Elowen, guarded after months of pain, did not fall into his arms. She accepted his care with quiet grace but kept a small, careful distance. "Trust is not rebuilt in a night, Alexander," she told him gently. "But I will not shut you out." He accepted that as a gift. Over the following weeks, Alexander Ashworth transformed. He publicly corrected a society matron who slighted Elowen's family at a dinner party, his tone icy and final. He invited Sir William to the manor and, with genuine difficulty, thanked him for being a friend to his wife when he himself had failed. He began accompanying Elowen to the village, carrying baskets, reading to the children, letting his stiff ducal dignity soften under her influence. And every night he left a small handwritten note under her door, not grand declarations, but simple truths. "Today I saw you laugh at the market. I want to be the reason for that laugh someday. And the locket you kept all these years is the dearest thing I own, because it proves your heart was always true." Slowly, Elowen's careful walls began to dissolve. One evening she found him in the garden, looking up at the stars, and she slipped her hand into his. He turned, surprised, and saw the warmth in her eyes that he had once only dreamed of. "You are becoming the man I always hoped you could be," she whispered. He pulled her gently into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt truly seen. The final healing moment came on a soft summer night a year later. They stood on the same terrace where she had once felt invisible, now hand in hand, watching fireflies rise over the gardens. Inside, Charlotte was playing the piano, and the village children had been invited for a small celebration. Elowen carried a new secret, the slight swell beneath her gown that she had told Alexander only that morning. He had wept again, this time with joy, and knelt to kiss her still flat belly with a reverence that made her heart overflow. "I loved you too late," he murmured against her hand, "but I will love you forever, and I will never let you feel invisible again." Elowen lifted his face, her eyes bright. "You are not late, Alexander. You are exactly when you were meant to come home." He rose and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and a future finally shared. The Duchess, who had stopped waiting, had found not only her own strength, but the love she had always deserved.